Welcome to the Bold Moves How Did You Know podcast, a podcast for the naturally curious who want to define their own path. I'm your host, Kristen Rocco, and here I'm sharing bold move stories that propelled my guests from curiosity to action. And in doing so, they've defined a path that is purposeful to them. Through these stories, I hope you'll be inspired to pursue your boldest dreams. I am so excited to introduce you to my guest today. Her name is Andrea Bartz, and she is the New York Times bestselling author of We Were Never Here, which was also a Reese's book club pick. I have it right here on my desk. This is what it looks like. So if you haven't read it yet, please pick up a copy. It is amazing. Her debut thriller was The Lost Night. It was an LA Times bestseller. Her second book, The Herd, was named a Best Book of the Year by Marie Claire. Crime Reads, Good Housekeeping. Her most recent thriller, The Spare Room, was a GMA bonus buzz pick, a Marie Claire book club pick, and a Best Book of the Summer by People, Shondaland, Glamour, Elle, and Harper's Bazaar. Her fifth book, which is called The Last Ferry Out, was just announced to release on June 17th. So, Andy, I am just so grateful to have you on the show today. Thank you for being here and welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And actually, there is an update, which is that The Last Ferry Out is now coming out May 20th.
So many people that listen to this podcast are interested in writing and storytelling and becoming an author. And I just was so excited to get you on the podcast to talk about all of it. When I run this podcast club and I ask those who sign up, what is your next bold move? What are you thinking? Where's your desire leading you to? And so many people are saying writing a book is a bold move they're pursuing. I know I talked about like all of these incredible achievements, but I am always so curious about the hard work that goes into that. And I think that's kind of the nature of this podcast. We see all the external success of people, but what goes into that? What's the hard work, the step-by-step approach? So my first question for you is, was becoming an author always your plan?
Yeah, well, thank you for that intro and that question. And I would say too, like you were hitting the highlights and I'll tell you about all the hard work that went into it, but you also, a bio leaves out all of the rejections and hard parts and times you want to give up and all those things. In my case, when I was little, I wanted to be an author. That was like what I wrote in the line that said, what I want to be when I grow up. And then in college, I discovered magazine journalism. And I was interning at magazines kind of at the tail end of the glory days of magazines, the glory days of sort of the Devil Wears Prada era. But I didn't know it was the very end. I just thought it was fantastically fun seeming. So I was like, oh, forget being an author. I want to be a magazine editor. And so I, as you mentioned, had a career working at some different magazines, and I really, really loved it, and maybe would still be doing that today if the bottom hadn't kind of fallen out of that industry. And during one of those transitions where I had been laid off, a magazine I was working at had folded. I started working on a manuscript, kind of for fun, kind of to see if I could do it, with the hope that someday it might become something. And that did eventually become my debut, The Lost Night. And in the process of writing it, I rediscovered my dream of being a novelist too.
That is so interesting. And I love how you explained a situation that happened to you, that happens to so many of us. There's always restructuring. There's always an industry that's shaking up or changing. And it can leave some of us in the lurch to be like, oh my gosh, now what? How did you decide to pick up a manuscript?
Yeah, well, I definitely thought I was going to find another job. And sort of the problem was, that's what I had done every other time I'd been laid off. I kept working at magazines that folded. And not sometimes when I was at them and sometimes shortly after. I worked at Glamour. Now there's no print magazine. I worked at Martha Stewart's Whole Living. I worked at Fit Pregnancy. I worked at Natural Health. I worked at all of these magazines that ceased to exist in their print form around that time. And I, was able to freelance for a little bit and dust myself off and find a new job. The problem was with my last position, I was essentially an executive editor. I was like the number 2 editor on the masthead. There just aren't that many roles at that level, especially not, this is about 10 years ago, especially not in 2014 or so, squarely sort of the end of that glory era. I think the glory era was squarely over by then. So I was working on the freelance stuff and it was taking longer than normal. And I had loved that job. And it was really upsetting to have come into work one random Tuesday and like found, just to find out the whole thing was over. And so
Yeah.
I think I wanted to work on something that was mine and that wasn't for another outlet, wasn't just a freelance article, something that I had some ownership over and that I couldn't just wake up one Tuesday and find out had been taken away from me. So I had some friends, when you're working in publishing and journalism, you're going to meet other people who had written books. I knew some other magazine editors who had written books. And so it didn't seem
Yeah.
quite as foreign. It kind
Mhm.
of just seemed like, well, you just have to sit down and do it. So I just started working and putting in a little bit every week, and brick by brick, it became an entire manuscript. A really awful one because I didn't know anything yet about how to write a novel that works and makes any sense.
Yes.
But once you've got something down, then you have something you can play with.
I love how you said that you wanted something that you could be in control of. And especially in today's world, I think with all the restructuring that happens, with all the layoffs happen, corporate America used to be known as like a stable environment. But I mean, I'm finding that's not necessarily the case. And it's really helpful to have a plan B. So I love the idea of like, what can somebody do that they have control over that can make them money if something should go south? And it sounds like that plan B ended up working out for you. You were able to transition into a published author. I read somewhere that your first novel got rejected by every publisher you sent it to. So I would love to hear your rejection experience because there's so much in there too, right? Like, what did you learn out of all of those rejections? First of all, what did it feel like? Did you just want to put the first manuscript in the trash and never return again? Or how did you pick yourself up to say, I'm going to rework this?
Yeah. So when I finished The Lost Night and I had done years of revising on my own and having friends read it and really getting it as strong as I could, I actually started, instead of sending it to publishers, I started kind of the traditional way, which is sending it to literary agents with a process called querying. I sent query letters
Okay.
to agents. And I pretty quickly got an offer from an agent. And when you get one offer, then you're able to go back to everyone that you've
Mhm.
sent your manuscript to, sent the query to, and say, hey, FYI, I have this offer. And as a courtesy, I'm happy to give you a week to read it too if you would like to consider it. So, because of that, I was able to shake the tree pretty quickly. And I ended
Yeah.
up with 3 offers of representation from agents, which was amazing and
Mhm.
beyond my wildest
Mhm.
dreams. And when you have calls with these agents, they're just telling you how great you are and how excited they are about the manuscript and how fresh and exciting it is and how confident they are that they can sell it. And so I really felt like, oh my gosh, like I've done it. I have like written the manuscript, I've secured the agent, and like from here on out, it's nothing but smooth sailing. At
Sailing.
that point, my agent, so I did a little bit of, revisions with her until she felt like it was ready, and then she went on submission. So she sent it out to her list of editors that she thought would be really excited about it at different publishers. And a few weeks passed and I checked in and she was like, yeah, unfortunately, it's been nothing but no's yet, but it's still out with a few people. And I said, can I read the rejections that have come in? And her agent replied and was like, here you go, and sent a Word document. And that was devastating. It was just reading rejection after rejection. And, they weren't mean. They were like, this is really strong, but this isn't working for me. There were just all these reasons that these people didn't want to publish this manuscript. And I was bereft, and my agent was
Uh-huh.
surprised. And I was just like, how it was such a shock. I felt like I was really on the right path and like the end was in sight. And then here we were back at square one. And to make it worse, my agent had said before we started querying that I'm confident that we can sell this, but if not, we should have a discussion about whether we start pitching it to kind of smaller presses
Yeah.
or if we just start working on your next project. Because she said, you only get to debut once, and I'm not sure that it would serve you as a debut author to have a kind of a small, quiet debut. And I was like, that doesn't matter. Everyone's going to want it anyway. Like, it barely even took that in. And now here we were facing the reality that all whatever it
Yeah.
was, 16 editors had passed. So from that, luckily, one editor said, I can't buy this in its current form, but if the author is willing to make some major changes and revise it, then I would look at it again. It's called a revise and resubmit. And
Okay.
it is far from a guarantee that anything will happen. I mean, I know people personally who have done a revision, done the resubmission, and then still gotten a pass. So I had a call with this editor, and she wasn't my editor yet, so she didn't have any obligation to sort of fix the things. So the call was just a litany of all of the weaknesses and problems with this manuscript and everything
Ooh.
wrong with it. And, it wasn't her job to brainstorm how to fix it. It was just like, here are all of the things that aren't working. And so I moped around for a little bit after I got that dose of reality. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm going to go for it. Like, what other choice do I have? I'm not going to stop now. And so I sort of dusted myself off, and I spent another 4 or 5 months, like really intensely editing it, changing the story, reworking things, changing character threads, changing the plot. I put my
Wow.
all into it and
Mhm.
sent it back to my agent, and she felt like it was ready. So she sent it to that editor again. And thank God that editor was happy with the revision and wanted to
Yeah.
offer a book deal. And she has now been my editor for all of my books. So I've been working with her ever since.
Wow, how amazing that she was interested or at least got on the phone with you to say everything that needed to be fixed,
Yeah.
and then, of course, up to you to go and fix it, but what did that teach you about feedback? I asked this maybe from a little personal perspective too, because I think early in my career, I saw feedback as critical, and over time I've come to jive with it more
Mhm.
as helpful, collaborative. Yeah, what's your relationship with feedback now?
So I think that because I worked as a journalist for
Mhm,
years, before I was
mhm.
working on books, I'm pretty practical about it. I would much rather somebody be clear about what's not working and what needs to change than just sort of pussyfoot around it. So the rejections felt very personal, and the stuff that like they didn't
Yeah,
want me to fix about how this character wasn't likable enough or the stories felt too tropey or whatever, like that felt incredibly personal. But somebody
yeah.
giving me notes on what needs to change, I'm like, cut out the emotional part. I don't care. I want you to tell me exactly what's not working and how to fix it.
Mhm.
And I remember my agent even being like, okay, I can tell from the way that you take feedback that, like, yeah, this isn't an ego thing. This is you like really wanting specificity. And I was like, yeah, don't waste my time. Don't waste your time. My emotions are not invested in whether the character is 28 or 35. Like that I don't care. Just tell me what you think is better. So that's not to say that I don't have
Yeah.
all sorts of responses, feelings when I do get all those notes, but it's less that I feel that I take them personally, and it's more that I feel overwhelmed by like how much work is in front of me and how many problems I need to
Totally.
solve. That was sort of a
Mhm.
blessing coming from the world of journalism. There isn't time in the journalism world. I have a whole preamble about how great something is before you can get into what needs to change. It's just like, this is a business. This is a business transaction. This is feedback, and it needs to be
Yeah,
better so that it's more sellable. And I want the book to
yeah,
sell, so off we go. And
yeah,
of course, there are other
yeah.
authors who maybe feel a little bit more like artistes. And of course, I would fight for something that I just disagreed with or that was really important to me. But on the whole, I have always thought of my books as both a piece of my heart that I splatter all over the page and the product that I sell as a one woman business. And so it behooves me to just not spend time crying over the feedback and instead spend that time figuring out how to implement it.
I want to get into how you find some inspiration for all of your stories. I read this interesting story about your mom being a librarian, and the library purged a collection of horror and thriller novels that you guys then got to take over in your home and create this mini library collection of all these trashed books from the library. So I should back up and say to all the listeners that Andy is a thriller novelist, writing a lot about these intense situations, dramatic series of events that occur to her characters. So I'm just curious where you got your interest in thrillers. What is it about the genre that appeals to you?
Yeah, yeah. So I always loved the dark kind of books. As a kid, I loved Goosebumps and scary stories to read in the dark, and Lois Duncan and Christopher Pike, and just like all of the scary stuff was always appealing to me. I mean, who knows why, but my mom, to her credit, very much was like, whatever you want to read, you can read it. So I was reading Stephen King when I was probably way too young and that kind of thing. And I think the reason is my sister is the same way. She's also a thriller author, and we both love like horror movies and scary books and haunted houses. And I think, at least for me, I mean, I'm kind of a scared person. I'm kind of like a anxious, sort of neurotic person. And so I really find it soothing to have these like safe ways to explore and experience fear, and to think about what I would do, and to kind of work out possible different scenarios, and, to come out of it feeling empowered in some way. So I think I was sort of destined to write somewhat scary books. And in terms of what inspires the actual topics of them, they're generally inspired
Yeah.
by things I worry about myself. Something horrible happening while I'm on vacation, something horrible happening to someone I love. Distilling that fear into something that I can look at head on and wrestle with on the page, and therefore take some kind of control over it.
Do you end up having dreams about some of these scenarios? Because I suppose when they like intercept your mind so much, maybe I would dream about it.
I don't think I do. I have had people tell me that my book has inspired dreams while they're reading it, which is pretty crazy to
Really?
me. Like, I am truly in your subconscious. But I feel like when I'm working on a book, I very much go in a flow state, or almost like a fugue state while I'm working on it. And then when I'm away from it, I don't think my brain's working through it at night. I'll have an idea on a
Yeah.
walk or in the shower or something like that. But I feel like night is when that part of my brain takes some time off.
Yeah, shut down that part of the brain. Let's maybe switch to the happy-go-lucky comedies at this point.
Exactly, exactly.
Um,
It's like ending the night with an episode of whatever, What We Do in the
yeah,
Shadows, so that you're get a little humor before
yeah.
bed.
So for people who are interested in writing as a creative practice, or becoming an author, like what are some of the things, the habits, the practices that you do to honor your work? The book that comes to mind for me is Stephen Pressfield's Resistance, where it's like there's just so much resistance that comes into the work of writing, right? Like it's so easy just to stop and go and do other things. But do you have habits or practices that help you keep the creativity coming, new ideas, etc.?
I do. When I'm in writing mode, I try to do writing sprints using what's called the Pomodoro method. So generally, it's like 20 or 25 minutes on of working with my phone, with notifications turned off, and my phone in another room, very important, with a timer running. And then when the timer goes off, you take a break, 5 or 10 minutes, and then you repeat. And the secret to it is that when that 20-minute timer begins, if I don't know what to write in my manuscript, if the blank page is overwhelming me, then I also have a document that's just called free writing, like free writing for this project.
Mm,
And I'll open that and I'll just start, like, any thought that comes to my head, I will get out. I don't know what's happening with this book. This book is terrible. This book is never going to sell. Why are these characters in this room? How do I get on to the next scene? Like, just whatever kind of junk is running through my mind and in my stream of consciousness. But the act of writing does trigger something and sort of gets you into that groove, even when inspiration feels like it's a million miles away. And so frequently, just that act of free writing sort of jogs something so that I can go back to the manuscript document and keep working. And I think that's a really valuable practice, whether you're hoping to become a published author or just wanting to sort of develop the writing part of your brain. Free writing, which
yeah.
is different from journaling, because you're literally, every thought should go down. Like, this doesn't need to make sense. You just need to move your fingers, or, move your hand over the page. It's
Yeah.
really freeing. And I think it taps into something and unleashes some creativity. And I think it's a really healthy thing to do. Another related tip is that when I'm writing in those early stages, I have to tell myself this is only for me. And I think a real trap is thinking about who might be reading this later. And that can sort
Mm,
of just shut down, like a barn door, that can just slam your ability to
mhm.
create shut. My entire first few drafts, nobody sees but me. No one, like, they exist exclusively on my computer. And it's several revisions before even my very first readers get to take a look at it. And just knowing that is really freeing because it can be bad. It can make no sense. It can, have tons of contradictions and issues that I know I'm going to work out later. And so I think it really frees you up if you can tell yourself and hold yourself to that commitment that like this is just for me for now. And if I want to make it something later, I can. But at this stage, it's for me.
Your experience being an editor is so helpful in how you are able to go back through your writing and make the tweaks. But how did you learn the structure and the plot
Mhm.
and how to character development? Like when you sat down to write your first book, did you already sort of know that, or was it a process of educating yourself as you were writing the book?
Yeah. So when I was writing the first draft of the first book, I had no idea what I was doing. And it definitely showed. Like the final results was technically a manuscript because it existed, but it did not follow any of the conventions. And at that point, I was like, I think I need to call in some reinforcement and ask friends for recommendations. So a few
Okay.
books that are really helpful for kind of figuring out how to write a novel include a book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, which is all about structure and it kind of walks you through the traditional 3-act structure that 99% of the stories that we experience follow. So it's not about it being formulaic, it's not about it being predictable. It's just helping you organize a story into the way that we are hardwired as humans to experience it
Mhm.
and find it satisfying. So reading that was like a huge eye-opening experience because suddenly I was like, oh,
Yes.
like this needs to happen at this point. This needs to build toward that. That was hugely clarifying. Another book that was recommended by a friend that I found very helpful is called The Anatomy of Story by Jonathan Truby. And I always
Yes.
feel like I need to make a little disclaimer that like Truby kind of seems like somebody I don't want to hang out with. He just always uses examples of, he says at the beginning, like, I'll refer to the hero as he throughout, even though it could also be a woman. And he loves
Oh,
Tootsie. He's always using the movie Tootsie as an example, even though that's a pretty problematic movie. So, huge caveat. But he does a really great job of breaking down how a book needs to work under the hood and how characters need to
mm,
relate, what different elements of a book need to do. And so I feel like reading that kind of gave me an education on how all of the little cogs in the machine come together and how I could be aware of that as I was writing and or revising. So it's one thing to try to work on instinct and maybe some people can do it. Some people just read a lot of books and then emulate it and
mhm,
kind of naturally do a lot of these things. But I
yeah.
feel like the quickest way to become more of a master, in addition to just reading tons of literature and just being a voracious consumer of books, is to actually kind of study the craft. So those are two really good ones for getting started.
I actually have John Truby's book on my bookshelf. It's been there for years and I haven't read it yet, but I will. I
Get
will
in
get
there.
there. I do content marketing for my career, so a lot of that has to do with storytelling and
Mhm.
understanding how our brains are wired for story and how to take readers through the natural evolution of it. So that's why I picked it up. But yes, I've got to dive in. I'm super interested in storytelling. I just love it. I am curious. So Andy has had some gnarly accolades. Okay. So like she was a Reese book club pick. It was 2021. Wow. And can you take us back to that moment? I mean, because I feel like that is the pinnacle of what authors dream of. Like they would love to have somebody like Reese Witherspoon, who is a voracious reader on her own and book lover, pick their book for that month. Take us back to that experience. What was it like getting that call? And then how did your life change after that? If at all, maybe it didn't.
Yeah. So it was June 2021 when I got the news. My book was supposed to come out in mid July. So we were only like 6 weeks out. And my editor emailed, and the subject line was just, we were never here. And the body said something like, do you have a minute to talk on the phone today? So I, of course, was like, oh, well, they're definitely canceling my book. Like, this has got to be something bad,
Yeah.
right?
Your brain goes to the worst
Of
news, of
course.
course.
Yeah, like no other information. So I called her and we got on the phone and she was like, so you know Reese's book club? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, well, your book is going to be the August pick. And there was like a long silence. And then I screamed. I was like, oh my God. So she then was like, congratulations, and then explained some stuff logistically that had to happen. It was going to move the publication date to the beginning of August. They had already started printing copies, so they were going to bring those back and sticker them with the Reese's Book Club seal. We were going to have to, yeah, I was supposed to like go on vacation that week. I was like, all right, I got to move some things around. It was like a totally surreal and shocking moment. And then I came out of my office, and my partner, Julia, had been in the kitchen, which, as you know, was right outside the office. And she'd heard me screaming. So she's like, what's going on? And I was like, my book is going to be the Reese's Book Club pick for August. And like, bless her, she's a data scientist. She like kind of smiled and she was like, the what pick for what? Which was great. It like, brought me back down to like, okay, right, good grounding. So it was kind of wild because it was 2021. And so I still couldn't really do in-person events. So my launch was virtual. I didn't go on any kind of tour. I just had like a small celebratory party with some friends here in New York. And yet the book sold fantastically well. It was the number one book on Amazon at one point for a few days.
Wow.
Which was truly insane. But like I was just home. And my partner and I both work from home, and I was like answering emails and getting a lot of texts. It was this weird kind of contrast. So in terms of how it changed my life, I mean, it definitely, because it sold so much better than my other books, it definitely helped my career, right? In terms of earning royalties, that was amazing. In terms of, my next book deal then being bigger, that was amazing. Being a part of sort of the Reese's Book Club community. Now I've like met other authors and stuff like that. That's been incredible. But yeah, at the end of the day, like I really wanted to be able to keep doing this, and I really wanted to reach as many readers as possible. Like that's the goal when you're writing this stuff. And so to have the pieces come together for that to happen was super special and like pretty once in a lifetime, once in a career. I'm so grateful it happened. And I didn't want to overly identify with it or tie myself to it. I want to just like keep writing different great books and finding new readers and challenging myself and taking advantage of just the amazing good fortune that came from that book being a Reese pick, but also keep moving on. Like I still have days that it's horrible to sit and write, and I hate what I'm working on.
Man, you got to keep doing the craft. It's not going to write itself.
Exactly.
Did I hear that We Were Never Here was also optioned or selected for a Netflix movie?
Yeah, good memory. So We Were Never Here was optioned by Netflix and Berlanti and Molly Sims production company. There's like 3 parties involved that optioned it for a Netflix film adaptation. I am not personally involved, but I sometimes get updates on what's happening, and I guess they're still working on it and working on a script, and they seem excited. So I've got fingers and toes crossed, but I've also learned we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. We'll see when that happens.
I love your perspective. It's like keep your eyes on the path forward and like how you're being inspired, and all of these things that are happening around you are sort of icing on the cake. And I'm sure they feel amazing when they happen, but it sounds like that's not necessarily all the motivation. The motivation maybe comes from within. Is that right?
Yeah, I love how you put that. And to be clear, I think it's really important to like take a minute when you're on the top of that mountain that you desperately wanted to climb in the distance, and to appreciate it and take it in and feel grateful and proud of yourself. So I definitely am not trying to like minimize any of those things. But at the same time, I think it's really dangerous to, I don't know, cling too closely to things over which you don't have control. Like I have zero control over whether the book actually becomes a movie on Netflix. There's absolutely no way that my caring about that or being too identified with it or really wanting it will make it more or less likely to happen. So for me, the goal has to be continuing to write books that I'm proud of and that are exploring themes that I find really crucial to communicate with people and that kind of thing. So yeah, I feel so grateful that these cool things have happened, but to have a goal, I'll only be happy if every book of mine from here on out hits the New York Times bestseller list. I can't control that. So you're setting yourself up for disappointment if you're aiming for external things that you can't control.
I'm so glad for that reminder, honestly. I think we can all get kind of caught up in an accolade or trying to achieve something, the next big title or whatever it is in your particular area. And career, that's not probably the right thing to be trying to focus on because you can't control that. And if it doesn't work out, you're going to feel really unsatisfied if it doesn't work out.
Yeah.
I am so interested to know. This is the same question, but like two slightly different ways. What is the boldest move you've made as an author?
So after We Were Never Here, my next book, which I was already hard at work on by the time We Were Never Here came out, but my next book, This Spare Room, is about a woman who sort of discovers her bisexuality during the pandemic and, comes out during lockdown. And that was this main character's experience in many ways mirrors my own. There was no, murder and mayhem in my experience, but elements of it certainly mirror my own. And it was really scary. And when I was writing it, I could tell myself it was just me in a room. Like I said, no one's going to read this. Don't worry, no one's going to read this. But especially leading up to publication, kind of the thing I feared the most happened, which is that reviewers, many readers and also professional reviewers, like kind of didn't get it. And in my opinion, there was like a lot of homophobia in their criticism of it because they really weren't talking about the plot. They were just so distracted by what they considered too much sex, which wasn't actually very much sex, but was not straight cis sex. And so just getting closer and closer to the publication day, knowing people that I knew and, respect were going to read it and possibly judge me, possibly, have very personal questions about me and everything was really scary. And I just remember publication night, I had felt so scared leading up to it. And then at my actual launch party, which, I was able to have a launch again, right? It wasn't the thick of the pandemic anymore. Okay. And I kind of realized, I was so scared going into it, but now I just feel brave. Like it sort of tipped over to like, no, I did this and I chose to do this. And the kind of amazing thing is that The Spare Room is by far my least liked book. The Goodreads is low, like the reaction was not roundly positive. And yet I have had the most people reach out to me and tell me for this book that it really spoke to them. It really meant something to them. They really connected with it. And so for me, that's kind of like the validation I needed, right? I set out to put words to a very vulnerable story, and the fact that it resonated for people was a much bigger reward than some probably cishet white dude at a trade magazine getting it and liking it and telling other people to read it.
Oh my gosh. Actually, I'm going back to what we were talking about in terms of external validation versus that intrinsic motivation. And it sounds like the theme and the topic and the conversation that you were having through those characters and that plot, even though scary, was something that you felt was needed in the world. And that kept you going to the end and seeing it through and then publishing it and bracing a little bit, it sounds like, for the reaction, but then coming to terms with it. And I think sitting with the discomfort, as you said, ends up making you a little more comfortable. You're like, you get kind of, I don't know if it ever feels completely comfortable, but the longer you sit with something uncomfortable, the more comfortable it kind of becomes. I wonder, had you come out before the book had published, or were you coming out as the book was talking about these themes as well?
Yeah, I had come out before the book was published. I hadn't made a big announcement. I hadn't told people one-on-one, really. I just started posting photos of my girlfriend Julia and I. And if people asked, I said, oh yeah, we're dating. And so that was sort of how people one by one got the memo, including my very conservative family, the people that know me since childhood in Wisconsin and stuff like that. So yeah, that took its own kind of bravery. And then it felt like even a ratcheting up of that to release a book with a character who not only is coming out as queer, but also sort of goes through a journey where she begins the book with a fiance, and her whole goal, her whole life plan is to marry him, get the house, get the white picket fence, get the minivan, and have the 2.5 kids. She's just certain that that's what she wants. And then over the course of the novel, she starts to wonder, well, wait a minute, did I actually want that? Or is that just sort of societal expectations placed on me since a little kid playing MASH when it was just the default assumption? And what if I
Yeah.
take a step back and question it? And sort of by the end of the book, she has realized that maybe she doesn't need to be in that sort of traditional wife and mother role. And maybe she doesn't actually want kids. And she ends with sort of a question mark of where she wants her life to go next. And that is a story that certainly echoes my own, but that we really are not comfortable
Yeah.
talking about in the mainstream. You know, certainly if a woman dares to say something about enjoying being child free on the internet, like, you know, hope, yeah, batten
Yeah.
down the hatches, like hang on tight, because there's going to be some serious pushback. I mean, I joked a very innocent tweet about it, and within a few days, Matt Walsh had made a video about me and how chaotic I am, and sent the incels after me. So there's
Oh man.
clearly a big backlash to that kind of thinking, but for me, that reinforced how crucial it is to have
Mm,
voices and perspectives outside
mhm,
of just the
mhm.
kind of traditional norms.
Totally.
And maybe now more than ever, now that we are going back, apparently.
Beyond becoming an author or a published author, I love how writing gives you that ability to explore themes and topics and conversations that are important to you in a bigger and broader way than maybe you can have conversations about, or that you can, yeah, talk with your family about, or, whatever. So I love the idea of free writing to kind of get all of that out too and see where that might take you.
Yeah, it's kind of
Um,
incredible how it can crystallize your thoughts. Like you think you're upset or excited or whatever it is
yeah.
about one thing, and then the act of free writing can really unleash like what's actually going on here. It's pretty magical. People should try it.
I did some research briefly on journaling, like the science of journaling and why it's so effective. Back when during the Olympics, actually, I was like hooked to the TV, by the way, for the entire Olympics. I just was so fascinated by it. I always am. But you would hear a lot of stories, and I think that it's pretty routine among the athletes that journaling is part of their mindfulness practices. And so anyways, as I was kind of doing an analysis around the Olympians and how they get to that type of success or that level of sport, I was learning that just what you said, that the act of journaling helps you find the nuance in your feelings
Mhm.
that you can't access when you're just thinking about it or talking about it. I mean, maybe if you talk enough about it, you can get there, but it really does help you unlock the layers and
Yeah.
find the little fine tooth details,
Mhm.
which is really cool. Few more questions for you. So you mentioned your sister's an author. I think she just had her debut novel. Is that right?
Her debut came out in 2023. The writing retreat came out in February 2023, and her next one's coming out in April.
Oh my gosh. So two sisters who are authors, which is so awesome. But you were the first author in the family. What advice did you give her about writing and publishing a novel?
That's a great question. So I think authors get so kind of wrapped up in the act of creating their manuscript that they
Mm,
don't give much thought to the fact that it's also a job and a business, and you're running a business and you have coworkers and employers in a sense in your
yeah.
publisher and the whole team around them. You're dealing with a marketer, you're dealing with a publicist, you're dealing with all their assistants, and then you have your agent who is sort of both your career manager but also your employee because they're taking 15% of your earnings. So you are employing them in that sense. And
Hmm.
today, authors are expected to be kind of a brand. And so that involves their own marketing and being on social media
Yes.
and doing a whole ecosystem of podcasts and interviews and blogs and just being very public. So I think a lot of authors, and understandably, you don't need to be overly obsessed with this when you're, the most important thing at the beginning is just write your book. Like don't fret about your
Yeah.
follower count way too early. Don't worry about it. If your book is
Yeah.
good enough, it's fine if you don't have a huge following. But all that said, yeah, I think early on we were doing a lot of discussion of kind of like workplace politics kind of stuff, how to handle this. Is this a weird thing? Like, should I go to my agent for this? Do you think this is weird? Is this normal? Does this seem right? Does it seem wrong? And that kind of thing. So I feel like that is where a lot
Mm,
of the advice was coming from on yeah, just
yeah.
navigating being a
Well,
one-man show.
to that To that point, I have some quick fire questions because I wonder if people who are listening would be interested in learning about this. So, but real quick. So, the structure of the whole business environment around, writing a book, becoming an author, when you have a manuscript, let's say you've got to the point where you have a manuscript, how does it work? Who do you go to first? You said that you went to a literary agent. Is that still how it works today? Do you go to a publisher? If somebody is ready to send their manuscript out for review,
Mhm.
where do they get started?
Yeah, so you should probably have other people read it before you're going out and trying to get an agent. It should feel very polished to you. So for that, you
Mm,
can pay for a developmental edit, with a professional editor that you have found, or you can send it to trusted friends, to beta readers. So yeah, the first step is getting it the best shape that you can. The next step is if you want to be traditionally published, I should make that caveat. If you want to do self-publishing, it's a totally different game. I don't know that much about it, but there's other resources out there for kind of learning about that. In the case of wanting to be traditionally published, you can't directly pitch your book to publishers. You need to have an agent who represents you, and they're the one who will send it to the right publishers. So you'll need to write a query letter. On my Substack, I have kind of a compendium of successful query letters that people can look at and learn from, and a link to an article I did about how I found my agent and how I narrowed down the list of what would be the right agents to target and that kind of thing. And then
okay.
once you have an agent, then they are the one who kind of takes it from there to actually get it into the right hands and hopefully solicit and offer a book contract. And then at that point, you begin working directly with that editor. And once things get a little further along, then you start working with the team of marketers and publicists and other people who will be involved in, copy editors and proofreaders, cover designers, all of the people in that ecosystem who will work together to actually make your book a physical thing that will be on
Yeah,
shelves.
that's so crazy. Is the book cover, is that a really exciting step? I could imagine like trying to get the visual element around the book is really
Yeah, it's
fun.
it's really it's fun, and it's a lot of back and forth, and it's a lot of like staring too much and like, do I like this? I feel like one thing that I should clarify, because I actually think that probably a lot of your listeners would be more like nonfiction writers. So everything that I'm talking about is for fiction, it's for novels. So if you were somebody who wanted to write an advice book or a lifestyle book or something that was nonfiction, the process isn't that dramatically different. You still probably are going to start by finding an agent, but instead of sending them a query letter with your manuscript ready to go, you would
Yeah.
send them a query and a book proposal. So when it's nonfiction, you get the agent, get them excited. They will sell that proposal to a publisher. And then once you have a book deal in place, then you run out and do your research and do your writing. Whereas
Mm.
for fiction writers, you have the whole book written first. So that's
Wow.
something to keep in mind too.
If you can't find an agent, do you find that people either move to self-publishing or do they just start on another project and hope that one works out?
I think there's a million different paths to publication and a million different ways people can do it. My personal feeling is that if you're getting no after no after no with agents, then I would put a pause on querying and see what you can learn from their feedback, because something is not working, whether it's your query letter, whether it's your pages. And, there are absolutely exceptions to this rule. There are people who queried 200 agents before they found their agent, and then they got a great deal at auction. So this isn't hard and fast, but in general, logically, if 199 agents said no to this project, then the odds that your agent, that 200th agent, is going to be able to go out to a dozen editors and find someone who falls in love with it feel a little bit more slim, right?
Yes.
Like something wasn't quite working for those agents. And so I think it's worth taking the time to step back and think about, if you want to continue querying, what you could change, how you could work on it. I also think starting on your next project, like you mentioned, is so critical when you're in that querying stage, because it reminds your nervous system that you are not just this one project. This is sort of a theme of mine, right? Like, you are not any one book. You will have tons more ideas. If you want to do this as a career, you can't just do one and then stop. So I think it's very soothing to get excited about your next project and to have something to sort of pour all that creative energy
Yeah.
into, instead of feeling like everything is riding on this, because it's out of your hands. Writing the next novel, that's in your hands. Waiting to find the right agent and then waiting when they're on submission to get the book deal, out of your hands.
Thank you for all of that. I've got one more question for you today, Andy. What do you know about being bold today you wish you would have known earlier on?
I wish I had come to terms with the fact that like not everyone was going to like me much sooner. I wish I had just given up on that notion much, much sooner and actually embrace the truth that if I was going to do what I set out to do, which involves being vulnerable, being brave, being honest, being perhaps controversial, showing through my writing and rage and kind of stuff we don't like talking about, that it was necessarily going to be a turnoff to some people. And it was just a huge revelation when I realized like some people are going to react really strongly and negatively if I'm doing it right. And so,
Yeah.
I think I grew up like a lot of women, just convinced I needed everyone to like me. And it was really freeing to learn like the right people will like me and others will hate me. And all I can do is write a book that I think is good.
That is the most amazing place to leave off this podcast. And I didn't mention this at the beginning, but Andy, you and I have known each other for like 10 years, I think. We met when I lived in New York. You're still there, but I moved away. And I have appreciated following your journey and your authenticity and the topics that you are so brave to have and that are needed in this world and in order for us to move forward and progress in the ways that we think and act. So thank you so much for sharing your journey, being so open with listeners about your experiences and giving some advice along the way. I really appreciate it. Listeners, and please go follow Andy if you want to be an author. There's no one better. On her Instagram, she gives practical tips for writing. She hosts writing retreats. She has a Substack, as you mentioned. So where can people find all of that?
Yeah, I would love to connect with people. Probably Instagram is sort of my main thing these days. I just got off X, which was very freeing. But I'm at Andy Bartz, ANDIBARTZ. My Substack is called Get It Right. That's andybartz.substack.com. And as you mentioned, it's tons of advice for writers and kind of insider intel on publishing. I do weekly interviews with authors where they share really amazing parts of their journey. And if you're into this podcast, there's a good chance that you might find something of interest there too. I just can't wait to hear from you.
Amazing. Thank you again so much, Andy, for being on the Bold Moves How Did You Know podcast. And for
Thank you so much.
everyone else, we will see you in the next episode. Bye for now.